Welcome to Switchers 101. I'm Stacy Rothwell, Sales Support Engineer for LPS, or the Live Production Systems Group. We thought it would be helpful to some of the newer account managers to go over exactly what a switcher is and some of the key terms that are going to be used by both us and your customers. This should help you in the initial discussions and keep you up to speed during the configuration and the negotiation process, ending in, hopefully, a sale. We understand that many of you may not fully understand what a switcher is and what it does, but we all know one thing about switchers: they retire a lot of quota. Actually, you may be thinking to yourself, I've never even seen a switcher, let alone know what it does. Actually, chances are you're wrong. Nearly everyone has seen a switcher. Recognize this?
Don't worry. We will deal with your rebel friends soon enough.
No.
Commence primary ignition.
Yes, in 1977, George Lucas used a switcher to fire the Death Star's weapon. Well, what is a switcher? From the beginning of television, there was a need to have several cameras in a studio and a need to switch between them for different angles, dramatic effect, whatever. Early on, this was literally a single row of buttons that a person selected which camera they wanted. Then, someone decided it'd be nice if instead of just cutting between the cameras, maybe we wanted to fade between them. The term for this is actually to dissolve between them. Next, as time progressed, more and more things needed to happen to the video. Wipes were invented, which allow one part of the video to reveal another. There was also the need to superimpose or layer video on top of other video. A common example of this is when they place the title of someone's name under them while they're talking. This is commonly called a super, short for superimposition. All was well in the analog TV era until, as legend has it, in the late 1970s, an engineer was working on a product to allow different video signals to be synchronized into a switcher. In order to completely synchronize video, one whole frame of video must be read into memory, held for a 1/30th of a second, and then released. Purely by accident, he discovered you could reposition the frame of video that was captured around the TV screen, simply by doing a little math. All right, a lot of math. This had never happened before, and the age of digital video effects, or DVE, began with a product called the Squeeze Zoom. With this new digital technology, which was easily integrated into existing analog switchers, production switchers were no longer limited to boring old dissolves and wipes. You could now fly video all over the screen. But it was expensive, very expensive. A typical DVE cost $300,000 or more in 1980 dollars. It also took up nearly 3 racks of electronic equipment. In the early 1990s, production switchers started to evolve into fully digital products that accepted a combination of analog signals that had been around for 40 years at that point, and the new digital signals. In fact, Sony had one of the very first digital production switchers, the DVS 8000, back in 1991. The digital signals held up much better than their analog counterparts in multi-generational use. Later, component digital signals cleaned up the signal to near perfection. Flash forward to today, a single production switcher in a TV truck for a typical NFL game will handle 30-plus cameras, 20 videotape and disc recorders, and as many as 20 graphic devices. The switcher not only handles all their inputs, but controls the tape decks and disc recorders and clip players and graphics machines, all with the push of a single button. Now that's a lot of power, especially when you consider that each of those signals has a data rate of at least 1.5 billion bits per second. Now multiply that by 80 inputs and 48 outputs, and you can see that an IT person sitting around with a bank of computers doesn't have anything on a single production switcher in terms of raw computing power. This is part of the reason switchers cost so much. Now, there have been a variety of manufacturers of switchers over the last 60 years. Most have come and gone, and some were a little bit late to the game. Today, there are a handful of production switcher vendors left. Sony, Thomson Grass Valley, Ross Video, and Snell & Wilcox are the dominant players in the large switcher market in the US, Sony and Thomson Grass Valley having the lion's share of the market. Depending on the type of customer you're dealing with, you may also hear about products from companies like Broadcast Pix, Foray, and NewTek. These companies tend to produce smaller switchers for the presentation, house of worship, and corporate markets. Typically, there are three types of switchers used in broadcast and production. The first is the routing switcher, or router. The routing switcher is perhaps the most boring piece of equipment in the entire plant. It is, however, one of the most important. Virtually every signal in the facility goes through the routing switcher, so its video, audio, timecode, and control signals can be sent somewhere else. A good example of this is if you want to make a simple dub from an HDCam SR machine to an XDCam HD deck. You would route the signal from the HDCam SR machine through the routing switcher into the XDCam HD machine. A routing switcher also lets you send the same signal to many different places at the same time. The next type of switcher is the master control switcher. Master control switchers also take signals in, but its primary purpose is to be the final point before transmission. Master control switchers are also designed for a single operator to be able to easily handle simple video and audio mixing right before air. The master control switcher's initial purpose was to be able to switch to a videotape recorder, or VTR, to run commercials during broadcast. Over the years, the master control switcher has evolved to do other things like a squeeze back over the credits to tease an upcoming show, or to do a voice over the credit roll. The last type, and what we'll concentrate on here, is the production switcher. Now, in the big picture, a production switcher acts a lot like either a routing switcher or a master control switcher. It has a number of input signals, and eventually it sends those signals somewhere else. The two big differences are that a production switcher generally only deals with video, not audio, and a production switcher doesn't just send a signal from in to out. Something always happens in the middle. Switcher is actually an all-encompassing term used to describe all the parts of a switcher system. The Sony MVS8000G, for example, has 4 distinct parts that make up the switcher. The processor itself, where most of the electronics that manipulate the video live, the device control processor, which lets the switcher control other equipment and light the little red light on the camera when it's on the air, the digital effects box, and lastly, the control panel. The control panel is normally the only visible part of the switcher system, and the only place the electronics can be told what to do. A typical switcher control panel would make Mr. Sulu quite jealous. Now, there are a ton of techno terms used by engineers and technical directors. A technical director, or TD, is the title of the person that operates a production switcher. In a typical control room, the director has the vision of what he wants to see on the air. He tells the TD what he wants to see, and the TD makes it happen. In some facilities, you may also see that the director and the TD are the same person. In industry jargon, this is called calling and punching your own show. We'll concentrate on some of the more common terms like inputs, outputs, ME banks, and keyers. Inputs to a switcher are like items on a menu in a restaurant. Everything that's available is listed, and you can choose which one you want. On a switcher, these inputs actually come in via coax cable and are fed into the back of the processor. The inputs are then accessed by these buttons on the control panel. Why so many buttons? Because in a live TV show, any input can be called at any time. It just wouldn't do to have to use a PC and a mouse and fumble all over menus to find the input the director wants. It would just take too long. Take a look at this example in the control room of a Fox NFL game.
2, 4, 3.
Super Bowl matchup, Jimmy.
Ready, 1. So we have the current preset.
But New England
2.
and Green Bay.
Oh wait. Ready, 3. Ready, 4.
Now, you can plainly see why any source needs to be available at any time. What's this ME thing? Well, it's not a me, it's pronounced ME, and it's an acronym for Mix Effects. The Mix Effects Bank, or ME, is like the kitchen in the restaurant. After we've looked at the menu, we might decide that instead of just a slice of turkey to eat, we might want a whole sandwich. A sandwich is made up of several parts. You've got your turkey, of course, but you also might need bread and mayonnaise and a little mustard, some onion, tomato, and lettuce. In a restaurant, the kitchen will prepare everything hopefully exactly as you ask. In video, with a switcher, the director may want to have camera 1 in a shrunken box on the upper left, camera 17 on a shrunken box on the lower right, with a nice background. On top of that, he wants a title saying who is in these boxes. Like the kitchen with our sandwich, the ME combines all these signals and makes one new composited signal, or sandwich. This area on the switcher's control panel constitutes a single ME. If you look carefully, you'll see that there are several of these MEs duplicated on the switcher. Why? Let's go back to our restaurant analogy again. One diner and one cook are just fine, but what happens during dinner hour? If we didn't have more than one cook, the restaurant could only offer the simplest of food. Otherwise, people would be waiting for hours as the single cook prepared a single order and then moved on to the next. Let's go back to our live TV example. So we've got this complex effect that we built right here. Now the director tells us he wants to do a transition from this to this. To do this, we have to actually use 3 separate mix effects banks. One for this part, one for this part, and one to do the transition. Put them all together and voila! Without separate ME banks, it would not be possible, or at least it would look really, really plain. When we configure a switcher with a customer, part of the SSE's job is to help figure out how many MEs the customer really needs compared to how much money he has to spend. Each ME costs money. Sony switchers can be easily scaled up and down in the number of MEs to exactly what the customer needs. In fact, in most cases, if the customer decides he needs another ME a few years down the road, we can just expand the switcher in the control panel. Very few other vendors offer that capability. Another term you'll hear from your customers is keys or keyers. Remember when we talked about the titles on the screen? Even though you're actually talking about superimposing one video over another, the technical term is actually called a key. Now, the term key is as old as television itself. When you bring that title in, what's really happening is the switcher looks at what you want to put on top of the background. It then cuts a hole in the background in the same shape as the new video and replaces it with the new source. When it does that, it's kind of like looking through an old-fashioned doorknob with a see-through keyhole. Someone came up with that analogy a long time ago, and the term still sticks today. Each keyer, the actual electronic device that makes this happen, is really just part of the mix effects bank. Think of it as a new skill our cook in the kitchen has learned. Most Sony switchers have 4 of these keyers on each mix effects bank, meaning that the customer can layer 4 things on top of a background. Actually, with our switcher and some electronic trickery, it's actually a lot more than that. Lastly, let's talk about outputs. Outputs are like the waitstaff in our fictional restaurant. It wouldn't do any of us any good if we ordered our sandwich, had a lot of cooks to prepare it, but only had one server to send the food out to the whole restaurant. On a switcher, more outputs mean more flexibility. For instance, in a typical TV station control room, you'll have a program or line monitor showing the main and final output of the switcher. You'll also have a preview monitor so I can see what's coming next on my main ME bank. But remember, in a Sony switcher, I can have 4 ME banks, so I guess we'll have to see a program and a preview monitor for each one of those too. Also, I have 5 monitors on the studio set that they like to see things in. Guess I'll have to put video in those as well. I think you get the picture. All of these constitute an output from the switcher. There are many more complex things we can do with outputs, like switch 2 or more shows at a single time. We can also have multiple control panels tied to a single switcher. Then we'd use different outputs to let each of those panels act on its own. The production switcher is one of the most complex and costly devices that Sony makes. We have 4 sales support engineers for live production systems who are experts in not only helping you sell a switcher, but clearly explaining to the customer why Sony is the best choice. Scott McQuaid and myself are ex-technical directors with over 50 years of switcher operation experience between us. Brian Grazier and Dana Goodwin are also experts and both come from long careers in Sony service. We also have a large support staff for your customers, including 2 switcher service specialists and many field service engineers. Any one of us is always happy to assist you in not only making the sale, but making sure the customer is happy that they chose Sony. Now, this sales process only works when you include the SSE from the very first moment you find out about a new switcher sale. Thanks for your time. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact any sales support engineer.